In the darkest corners of history, where superstition met flesh and doctrine controlled desire, medieval sexuality existed as a battlefield between human nature and iron-fisted authority. What passed for intimacy in those smoke-filled chambers and crowded hovels would likely shock even the most open-minded modern observer, a stark reminder of how drastically social norms have evolved. This isn't merely a tale of prudish restrictions or quaint customs. It's a journey into a world where the bedroom became a stage for public scrutiny, where whispers held more weight than vows, and where the line between sacred and profane was blurred beyond recognition. Medical ignorance bred horrifying practices, and the most basic human connections were warped by fear, power, and an almost unrecognizable understanding of the human body. Imagine your wedding night being less about love and more about survival, a transaction witnessed by prying eyes and judged by archaic standards. Picture yourself at 14, surrounded not by privacy, but by waiting villagers eager for tangible proof of your virginity, a concept as fragile as it was valued. Envision a world where your womb was believed to wander through your body like a living creature, where menstrual blood was considered poison, and where the wrong sexual position could supposedly summon demons to your bed. These weren't fringe beliefs held by the uneducated masses. They were the accepted truths that shaped laws, destroyed lives, and turned the most intimate human acts into public spectacles. The medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, witnessed humanity at its most contradictory. Great cathedrals rose toward heaven while human sexuality was dragged through the mud of ignorance and control, a testament to the enduring struggle between spirit and flesh. In this era, the Church held unprecedented power over both souls and bodies, dictating not just what people believed, but how they touched, when they could make love, and what positions wouldn't damn them to hell. Yet beneath this suffocating blanket of regulation, human desire persisted, finding expression in folk traditions, secret remedies, desperate acts of rebellion, and the quiet resilience of love in the face of impossible odds. What we're about to explore transcends mere historical curiosity. It's a window into how power structures infiltrate the most private aspects of human life, how societal anxieties shape our understanding of pleasure and intimacy. The sexual practices of medieval Europe reveal more than just bizarre beliefs. They expose the machinery of social control, the weaponization of shame, and the remarkable resilience of human intimacy in the face of systematic oppression. From the nobility's politically orchestrated marriages, designed to secure power and territory, to the peasantry's struggle for privacy in one-room huts, every class experienced sexuality through a lens distorted by superstition and authority. As we delve into these practices, remember that behind every strange custom and cruel law were real people, young brides trembling on wedding nights, couples seeking stolen moments of genuine connection, and individuals navigating a maze of restrictions that would seem absurd if they weren't so tragically real. Their stories deserve to be told, not for shock value, but as a reminder of how far we've come and how vigilantly we must guard against the return of such darkness, lest we forget the hard-won freedoms we now enjoy. The medieval world believed that knowledge itself could be dangerous, especially knowledge about the body and its desires. Church authorities and medical experts controlled information about sexuality with the same fervor they controlled religious doctrine, guarding the secrets of life and procreation as if they were weapons of mass destruction. What little education existed was filtered through layers of mythology, misogyny, and fear. The result was a society where the blind led the blind through the most fundamental aspects of human experience. A society where ignorance was not just bliss, but a carefully cultivated tool of control. Prepare yourself for a journey into a past that seems alien yet eerily familiar, a past where the personal was relentlessly political. In an age where misinformation spreads at digital speed and bodily autonomy remains contested ground, the sexual practices of medieval times serve as both a historical curiosity and a warning. What happens when ignorance becomes law? When superstition guides medicine, when the most natural human impulses are twisted into sources of shame and control? The answers lie in the smoke-filled huts and cold stone chambers of medieval Europe, where love and fear danced an uneasy waltz, a dance that continues to echo in our own time. The concept of marriage in medieval times bore little resemblance to modern romantic ideals. For the vast majority of people, marriage was a business transaction, as coldly negotiated as the sale of livestock or land. Daughters were commodities, their virginity a form of currency that could secure alliances, settle debts, or ensure survival through harsh winters. The practice wasn't limited to the poor. Among nobility, marriages were chess moves in elaborate political games, with young girls often betrothed before they could walk and shipped off to foreign courts the moment they began menstruating, their lives sacrificed on the altar of power. The Church, despite preaching about the sanctity of marriage, actively reinforced this transactional view, valuing obedience and procreation above all else. Canon law dictated that consent was necessary for marriage, but consent in medieval terms meant something vastly different from our understanding. A girl of 12, the minimum age for marriage under church law, could be considered capable of consent, and familial pressure often made refusal impossible. The Church's primary concern wasn't the happiness or well-being of the couple, but ensuring that marriages produced legitimate heirs and that sexual activity occurred within approved parameters. Love, affection, and mutual respect were secondary considerations, if they were considered at all. Public consummation, or at least public verification of consummation, was disturbingly common, a grotesque intrusion into the most intimate of moments. The practice took various forms depending on social class and regional customs. Among nobility, witnesses might stand outside the bedchamber door listening for appropriate sounds, their presence a constant reminder that the marriage was more about politics than passion. In some regions, the bloodied sheets would be displayed the morning after, proof of the bride's virginity and the groom's virility, a gruesome trophy of a forced conquest. For common folk, the entire wedding party might remain in the same room, separated only by curtains or wooden screens. Their presence was a form of community validation, a way of ensuring that the marriage was legitimate and that the bride was indeed a virgin. The obsession with virginity went beyond mere social custom. It was embedded in legal and economic structures. A woman's virginity was literally valued in monetary terms. Laws specified different penalties for rape based on whether the victim was a virgin, with virgin rape commanding higher fines paid not to the victim but to her father or husband, further reducing women to property. The notorious practice of droit du seigneur, whether historical fact or exaggerated legend, exemplified the ultimate commodification of female sexuality, suggesting that lords had the right to deflower brides on their wedding nights, a symbol of absolute power and control. Medical understanding of virginity was laughably inaccurate, yet deadly serious in its consequences. Physicians believed the hymen was a membrane that completely sealed the vagina until broken by intercourse, ignoring the biological reality that hymens vary greatly and can be stretched or torn by many activities. This misunderstanding led to countless tragedies. Women were accused of fornication because they didn't bleed on their wedding night, their reputations ruined by ignorance and superstition. Rape victims were dismissed because their hymens were already torn, their trauma compounded by disbelief and accusation. Elaborate fraud schemes involved vials of animal blood hidden in bedclothes, desperate attempts to conform to impossible standards. The examination of virginity itself became a ritualized form of sexual violence. Midwives, often the only medical practitioners allowed to examine women's bodies, were called upon to perform invasive inspections. These examinations, conducted with dirty hands and crude instruments, frequently caused the very damage they were meant to detect, adding physical pain to emotional distress. The results of such examinations could determine a woman's entire future, marriage prospects, social standing, even life or death in cases of suspected adultery. The commodification of virginity created a thriving underground market in virginity fraud. Desperate women and their families employed various deceptions: astringent douches to tighten vaginal muscles, hidden bladders of blood, even primitive surgical attempts to reconstruct hymens. The very existence of such practices reveals both the impossible standards women faced and their resourcefulness in navigating a system designed to control and exploit them. Medieval texts occasionally reference these deceptions, usually in the context of warning men against being fooled, never acknowledging the desperation that drove women to such measures, their struggles erased from official narratives. Medieval medical theory about human sexuality reads like a catalog of dangerous fantasies masquerading as science. The prevailing belief about women's anatomy was that the uterus was a separate, almost sentient organ that could move freely throughout the body. This wandering womb theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, suggested that an unsatisfied uterus would detach from its proper position and roam through a woman's body, causing everything from hysteria to suffocation. The prescribed cure, regular sexual intercourse to anchor the wayward organ in place, a justification for sexual dominance disguised as medical advice. The concept of female sexual pleasure was simultaneously acknowledged and feared. Medieval physicians believed that conception required both partners to achieve orgasm, a theory that seems progressive until one considers its horrific implications. This belief was used to dismiss rape claims. If a woman became pregnant, authorities reasoned she must have experienced pleasure and therefore consented. This medical fiction destroyed countless lives, forcing rape victims to either attempt dangerous abortions or face accusations of lying about their assault, their bodies, and their pain dismissed by a patriarchal system. Menstruation was viewed with a mixture of fascination and revulsion that bordered on the pathological. Menstrual blood was believed to be toxic, capable of ruining crops, souring wine, dulling mirrors, and even causing leprosy in children conceived during a woman's period. These beliefs weren't confined to folklore. Learned physicians wrote treatises on the dangers of menstrual blood, and church law forbade sexual intercourse during menstruation. Women were often banned from food preparation, religious services, and even physical contact with their families during their periods, their bodies deemed impure and dangerous. The medical approach to male sexuality was equally bizarre, but notably less punitive. Physicians believed that semen was refined blood produced in the brain and stored in the testicles. Excessive loss of semen through masturbation or frequent intercourse was thought to cause weakness, blindness, and madness. Yet moderate sexual activity was considered essential for male health, a double standard that persists in various forms today. Treatments for impotence ranged from the merely ineffective, consuming ground rhinoceros horn, to the actively harmful, applying burning nettles to the genitals. Medieval contraception and abortion practices occupied a shadowy realm between folk medicine and witchcraft. Women whispered recipes for herbal contraceptives, pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, and tansy among the most common. These herbs, while sometimes effective, were also potentially lethal, causing everything from liver failure to uncontrollable bleeding. The church condemned all forms of birth control, but economic reality meant that even the most devout sometimes sought ways to limit family size. Midwives who provided such knowledge walked a dangerous line between healer and heretic, their expertise both valued and feared. The treatment of sexually transmitted diseases revealed medieval medicine at its most horrific. Syphilis, known as the Great Pox, was treated with mercury, a cure often worse than the disease. Patients would be confined to overheated rooms, forced to inhale mercury vapors until their teeth fell out and their minds deteriorated, a slow and agonizing descent into madness. Gonorrhea treatments involved inserting metal sounds into the urethra or applying caustic substances to genital sores. The suffering caused by these cures was often interpreted as divine punishment for sexual sin, adding spiritual torture to physical agony. Perhaps most disturbing was the medical establishment's approach to pregnancy and childbirth. With no understanding of germs or infection, physicians and midwives routinely performed internal examinations with unwashed hands, spreading puerperal fever that killed up to a third of new mothers. Difficult births were addressed with brutal interventions. Craniotomy hooks to extract dead fetuses, primitive cesarean sections performed without anesthesia on women almost certain to die from infection. The medical motto seemed to be that any intervention, no matter how violent or misguided, was preferable to letting nature take its course. The medieval church's regulation of sexuality created a web of rules so complex and contradictory that compliance was virtually impossible. Sexual intercourse was forbidden on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, during Lent, Advent, Whitsun Week, and Easter Week, on feast days of apostles, martyrs, and virgins, during pregnancy, while breastfeeding, and during menstruation. When all these prohibitions were tallied, married couples were left with fewer than 50 days per year when sexual relations were technically permitted. The purpose wasn't to eliminate sex, but to ensure that every act of intimacy was tinged with guilt and required confession, a constant reminder of their supposed sinfulness. The church's obsession with sexual positions reached levels that would be comical if the consequences weren't so severe. Only the missionary position was sanctioned, as it supposedly reflected the natural order of male dominance and female submission. Any deviation, woman on top, standing positions, or entry from behind was considered unnatural and therefore sinful. These weren't minor infractions. Penitential manuals prescribed years of fasting on bread and water for such violations. The logic was that any position that prioritized pleasure over procreation opened the door to demonic influence. Confession became a tool for sexual surveillance that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Priests were instructed to ask detailed questions about parishioners' sexual activities, creating a comprehensive catalog of who was doing what with whom. Penitential manuals provided scripts for these interrogations, with questions growing increasingly specific. Have you done what some women do? Contriving a certain engine or implement in the shape of the male member, the size to match your desire? The confessional booth became a space where the church's prurient interest in sexuality merged with its mechanisms of control, a dark mirror reflecting the anxieties and obsessions of the era. The concept of conjugal debt added another layer of complexity to medieval sexual ethics. Church doctrine held that spouses owed each other sexual access on demand. Refusal was considered a sin that could justify adultery or annulment. This doctrine created impossible situations, particularly for women who might be exhausted from childbearing, injured from previous births, or simply uninterested. The church simultaneously preached sexual restraint and sexual obligation, leaving couples to navigate between the Scylla of lust and the Charybdis of marital neglect. Punishments for sexual transgressions varied wildly based on gender, class, and the whims of local authorities. A nobleman caught in adultery might face a fine or mild penance. A peasant woman guilty of the same crime could be stripped naked and whipped through the streets, her body a public spectacle of shame. Homosexuality, termed sodomy and conflated with heresy, carried penalties ranging from castration to burning at the stake, a brutal expression of intolerance and fear. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. Some regions turned a blind eye, while others conducted aggressive purges. The church's treatment of clerical sexuality revealed stunning hypocrisy. While priests were theoretically celibate, clerical concubinage was so common that many dioceses simply taxed priests for keeping mistresses. The children of these unions, termed priests' bastards, occupied a strange social position, officially non-existent, yet often educated and provided for by their fathers. Meanwhile, the same priests who fathered these children delivered sermons on the evils of fornication and performed invasive inquiries into their parishioners' bedrooms. Perhaps most tragically, the church's sexual regulations created a culture where victims of sexual violence had nowhere to turn. A woman who reported rape faced questions about her own behavior, dress, and sexual history, her character scrutinized as if she were the one on trial. If she was believed, a rarity. The focus was on the damage to her father's or husband's property, rather than her own suffering, her trauma reduced to a financial loss. The church's emphasis on female purity and male authority created a perfect environment for predators who knew their victims would likely stay silent rather than face the shame and scrutiny that came with speaking out. The sexual lives of medieval nobility operated under different rules than those governing common folk, though these rules were no less bizarre or oppressive. Royal marriages were international treaties written on the bodies of young women, with consummation serving as the seal. The wedding night of a noble couple was often a semi-public affair, with high-ranking witnesses present to verify that the marriage had been physically completed. This wasn't mere ceremony. Unconsummated marriages could be annulled, potentially triggering wars or collapsing carefully negotiated alliances. The age at which noble girls were married off shocks modern sensibilities. Margaret Beaufort gave birth to the future Henry VII when she was just 13, her body so damaged by the ordeal that she never bore another child. Child brides were common among the nobility, shipped off to foreign courts where they were expected to produce heirs despite their physical and emotional immaturity. The justification was always political necessity, but the human cost was paid in pain, trauma, and often death. Noble women's sexuality was policed with extraordinary vigilance. Ladies-in-waiting monitored menstrual cycles, reporting to anxious husbands and fathers, their bodies constantly under surveillance. The slightest irregularity sparked rumors of pregnancy, or worse, attempts to prevent conception. When Eleanor of Aquitaine was rumored to have taken lovers, the scandal reverberated across Europe. Yet noblemen's extramarital affairs were not just tolerated, but expected. Bastard children of nobles often received titles and lands, while their mothers, whether willing mistresses or victims of coercion, remained forever tainted. The practice of dynastic breeding created genetic nightmares that medieval medicine couldn't begin to understand. The Habsburg jaw, the hemophilia that plagued European royalty, the mysterious illnesses that claimed prince after princel stemmed from the narrow gene pools created by endless intermarriage. Yet the solution to failed pregnancies or sickly heirs was always the same. Blame the woman, try again, perhaps with a younger bride if the current one had failed too often. Noble courts developed elaborate rituals around fertility and pregnancy. Queens and duchesses underwent public examinations to confirm pregnancies, gave birth before audiences of courtiers, and had their infants inspected to verify sex and physical soundness. The birth of a potential heir was too important to be left to privacy. Royal physicians, often more concerned with astrology than anatomy, prescribed bizarre treatments for infertility, bathing in the blood of virgins, consuming powdered gemstones, or copulating during specific planetary alignments. The sexual education of noble children was a study in contradictions. Boys were often introduced to sex through castle servants or prostitutes, their fathers arranging these encounters as rites of passage. Meanwhile, noble girls were kept in deliberate ignorance, supervised constantly to prevent any knowledge that might compromise their value as virgin brides. This double standard created wedding nights where terrified, ignorant girls were paired with boys trained to see sex as conquest rather than connection. The culture of courtly love added another layer of complexity to noble sexuality. Knights pledged themselves to married ladies, composing poetry and performing feats in their honor. These relationships were supposedly chaste, but the line between spiritual devotion and physical desire was deliberately blurred. The literature of courtly love is filled with sexual tension, stolen kisses, and elaborate justifications for why adultery in the name of true love might be morally superior to dutiful marriage. This created a sophisticated culture of sexual intrigue where appearances mattered more than reality. Life for the medieval peasantry meant that privacy was a luxury as rare as a full stomach. Entire families shared single-room dwellings with their livestock, creating an environment where sexual intimacy occurred within earshot and often within sight of children, parents, and animals. The modern concept of the private bedroom simply didn't exist. Couples seeking moments alone might venture into fields or forests, but even these escapes carried risks from both human watchers and the very real dangers of medieval wildlife. Despite these constraints, peasant courtship developed its own rituals and customs. Bundling, practiced in various forms across Europe, allowed courting couples to share a bed fully clothed, sometimes with a board between them, to prevent full contact. Communities treated this practice with a knowing wink. Everyone understood that boards could shift and clothes could be adjusted, but as long as appearances were maintained, honor was theoretically preserved. The practice reveals a pragmatic approach to sexuality that balanced human desires with community standards. Folk traditions surrounding fertility and sexuality flourished among the peasantry, often in direct defiance of church teachings. May Day celebrations featured explicitly sexual rituals, maypole dances that symbolized intercourse, fertility rites in freshly plowed fields, and temporary relaxation of normal sexual restrictions. The church railed against these practices, but rural communities maintained them, understanding perhaps better than their priests that survival depended on successful harvests and healthy children. Peasant women developed sophisticated networks for sharing sexual knowledge. Herbal contraceptives, abortion techniques, and remedies for sexual problems passed from mother to daughter, midwife to young wife. This knowledge was often coded in songs, rhymes, and apparent folklore to avoid church persecution. A song about gathering herbs under the full moon might actually be instructions for preparing contraceptive pessaries. These networks provided the only sex education many women received. The economic realities of peasant life profoundly shaped sexual practices. Children were both necessary labor and additional mouths to feed, creating complex calculations around family size. Couples might abstain for months after harvest when food was plentiful, then resume relations during lean times when another pregnancy could mean starvation. The rhythm method, unreliable as it was, became a survival strategy. Women tracked their cycles not from religious conviction, but from desperate necessity. Sexual violence in peasant communities often went unpunished or was treated as a minor property crime. A lord's rape of a peasant woman was barely considered rape at all, more like unauthorized use of property. Within communities, women who reported assault faced skepticism and shame. The concept of consent was murky at best. Economic desperation meant that many sexual encounters existed in gray areas between coercion and agreement. A woman who submitted to a man who controlled her family's tenancy wasn't exactly consenting, but neither was she being held down by force. Yet peasant communities weren't entirely without recourse against sexual predators. Charivari public shaming rituals involving noise, mockery, and sometimes violence could be directed at those who violated community sexual norms. An older man who married a much younger woman, a husband who beat his wife excessively, or a known rapist might find himself subjected to nights of torment. These rough justice rituals reveal that while peasant communities might have lacked formal legal power, they maintained their own standards and enforcement mechanisms. The medieval legal system's approach to sexual crimes created a labyrinth of injustice that varied dramatically based on location, class, and gender. Rape laws existed not to protect women, but to preserve male property rights. The crime wasn't violation of a woman's body and autonomy, but theft from her male guardian, father, husband, or lord. This fundamental misunderstanding of the crime's nature shaped every aspect of how sexual violence was investigated, prosecuted, and punished. The burden of proof in rape cases was essentially impossible for women to meet. Victims had to demonstrate that they had cried out continuously during the assault, fought back physically, showing wounds as evidence, and immediately reported the crime to authorities. Any delay, any moment of shock-induced silence, any failure to show sufficient physical resistance was taken as evidence of consent. The law literally required women to risk their lives resisting attackers to have any hope of justice. False accusation penalties created another layer of injustice. A woman who accused a man of rape but failed to prove her case, which was almost inevitable given the impossible standards of evidence, faced the same punishment the rapist would have received. This might mean fines that could bankrupt a family, public whipping, or even execution. The message was clear: better to suffer in silence than risk the double victimization of assault followed by legal persecution. The treatment of pregnancy resulting from rape reveals medieval law at its most cruel and illogical. As mentioned earlier, the belief that conception required female orgasm meant that pregnancy was seen as proof of consent. Rape victims who became pregnant faced an impossible choice: attempt a dangerous abortion and risk death, or prosecution for infanticide, or carry the child and be branded a liar and likely a whore. Some desperate women claimed supernatural assault rape by demons or spirits as the only way to explain pregnancy while maintaining their innocence. Adultery laws created a stark double standard that encoded male dominance into legal structure. A wife's adultery was always a serious crime punishable by public humiliation, whipping, imprisonment, or death. A husband's adultery was only criminal if it involved another man's wife, and even then punishments were typically lighter. Single women who engaged in sex faced fornication charges. Single men faced consequences only if their partners were married or virginal daughters of respectable families. The regulation of prostitution reveals medieval society's hypocritical approach to sexuality. Many cities licensed brothels, seeing them as necessary evils that protected respectable women from male lust. Prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing or badges, live in designated areas, and submit to regular inspections. Yet, the same authorities who regulated prostitution also periodically conducted moral purges, arresting and punishing the very women they had previously licensed. The women caught in this system had no good options, only varying degrees of exploitation. Perhaps most disturbing were the laws governing sexual relationships between people of different religions. Christian-Jewish sexual relationships were criminalized across Europe, with penalties ranging from fines to death. The Christian partner might escape with penance. The Jewish partner faced execution. These laws weren't just about religion, but about maintaining social hierarchies through sexual control. Similar laws governed Christian-Muslim relationships in Iberian territories, creating a sexual geography where crossing religious lines meant risking everything. The rise of witchcraft accusations in the later medieval period cannot be separated from anxieties about female sexuality. Women accused of witchcraft were often those who violated sexual norms, unmarried women who knew too much about herbs and bodies, widows who remained sexually active, or simply women who rejected male authority. The witch trials that would reach their peak in the early modern period had their roots in medieval conflations of female sexuality, supernatural power, and social disorder. Accusations of witchcraft often centered on sexual elements. Witches were said to have sex with demons, cause impotence in men, and steal penises, keeping them as pets that required feeding with oats and hay. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, these fantasies revealed deep male anxieties about female sexual power. The physical examinations for devil's marks, where women were stripped, shaved, and probed for unusual marks or insensitive spots, constituted a form of sexual torture disguised as legal procedure. The knowledge that could mark a woman as a witch was often related to sexuality and reproduction. Understanding herbs that could prevent conception, ease childbirth, or enhance sexual pleasure was simultaneously necessary knowledge and dangerous power. Midwives occupied a particularly precarious position, respected for their essential skills, but suspected of dark knowledge. A string of difficult births or stillborn children could transform a midwife from community healer to accused witch overnight. The witch trials created a climate where any woman who stepped outside narrow sexual norms risked accusation. A woman who rejected a man's advances might be accused of casting a spell of impotence. A beautiful woman who attracted too much attention could be said to use supernatural allure. An older woman who maintained an active sex life violated expectations of post-menopausal asexuality and might be accused of sustaining her vigor through demonic pacts. The methods used to extract confessions from accused witches were explicitly sexual torture. The infamous witch's chair featured spikes positioned to penetrate genitals. Accused women were stripped naked for examination and torture, their bodies becoming public spectacles. The sexual sadism inherent in these procedures was justified as necessary for combating supernatural evil, but it clearly served to terrorize women into sexual submission. Communities that embraced witch hunts often experienced breakdowns in normal sexual relations. Husbands accused wives, neighbors reported on neighbors' bedrooms, and an atmosphere of sexual paranoia took hold. Young women accused older women of teaching them sexual magic. Men blamed their impotence or their wives' miscarriages on hexes. The witch trials weaponized sexual anxiety, turning intimate failures into evidence of supernatural crime. The legacy of medieval witch hunts extends far beyond their immediate victims. They establish patterns of sexualizing women's knowledge and power, of using sexual torture as interrogation, and of blaming women for male sexual anxieties. The figure of the sexually dangerous witch simultaneously withered crone and supernaturally seductive created stereotypes that would persist for centuries. The connection between witchcraft accusations and medical knowledge particularly targeted women's understanding of their own bodies. Recipes for contraceptives became evidence of commerce with devils. Knowledge of herbs that could ease menstrual pain or assist in childbirth transformed into proof of supernatural powers. The witch hunts effectively criminalized women's attempts to control their own reproduction, establishing precedents that echo in modern debates over reproductive rights. As we reach the end of this dark journey through medieval sexuality, the overwhelming impression is one of systematic oppression meeting stubborn human resilience. Every attempt to control, regulate, and punish human sexuality met with corresponding attempts to evade, subvert, and survive. In the spaces between the rules, in whispered conversations between women, in folk songs with double meanings, in herbs gathered by moonlight, people created their own understanding of intimacy and desire. These acts of defiance, however small, offer a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. The medieval period's approach to sexuality reveals the dangers of allowing dogma to override human experience, of permitting those in power to regulate the most intimate aspects of life. When medical ignorance combines with religious authority and legal power, the result is a system that damages everyone it touches. The noble bride suffering through a public consummation and the peasant woman dying from a botched abortion were victims of the same fundamental error. The belief that human sexuality could and should be controlled by external authority. Their suffering serves as a stark warning against the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of defending individual autonomy. Yet perhaps the most disturbing realization is how many of these medieval attitudes persist in modified forms. The virginity tests still performed in some parts of the world, the ongoing battles over contraception and abortion, the treatment of rape victims in many legal systems, all have roots in medieval precedents. The wandering womb has been replaced by hysteria and then by new forms of medical dismissal of women's experiences. The regulation of acceptable sexual positions has evolved into continued persecution of LGBTQ+ individuals. These echoes of the past remind us that the fight for sexual freedom and equality is far from over. The medieval period also demonstrates how sexual oppression intersects with other forms of power. Class determined whether your wedding night was a private affair or a public spectacle. Religious identity could make consensual relationships into capital crimes. Gender dictated whether sexual knowledge made you a valued medical practitioner or a suspected witch. These intersections remind us that sexual freedom cannot be separated from broader struggles for human rights and dignity. Our fight for a more just and equitable world must include a commitment to dismantling all forms of oppression, including those that target sexuality and gender. What saved many medieval people from the worst excesses of their era's sexual dysfunction was the simple inability to enforce total control. Geographic isolation, inefficient communication, and the sheer complexity of human behavior meant that rigid rules often bent or broke in practice. Communities developed their own accommodations, turning blind eyes to necessary transgressions, creating spaces for human connection despite official prohibition. This resilience of the human spirit offers a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and resistance can flourish. The stories we've explored, from Elise's terrifying wedding night to the unnamed women who passed contraceptive knowledge through generations, remind us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about the most intimate human experiences. These ancestors navigated a world where love was dangerous, where desire was sin, where the wrong herb or the wrong position could mean death. Their struggles created the foundations for our own ongoing battles for sexual autonomy and dignity. By remembering their stories, we honor their sacrifices and strengthen our commitment to building a better future. As we close this chronicle of medieval sexuality, we're left with both horror at what was and gratitude for what has changed. The journey from a world where wandering wombs and demon sex were medical facts to one of imperfect scientific understanding and incomplete sexual freedom has been long and difficult. But it's a journey that remains unfinished. The medieval period stands as both historical curiosity and cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens when fear triumphs over knowledge, when control matters more than compassion, and when the most human of experiences becomes a battlefield for power. In understanding their darkness, perhaps we can better protect our own and build a world where sexuality is a source of joy, connection, and liberation, rather than fear and oppression. So, if we take away just one thing from this exploration of medieval sexuality, it's this: that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable oppression, the human spirit or need for connection, for intimacy, for love finds a way. The medieval period reveals the profound dangers of allowing fear and dogma to dictate our understanding of the human body and our relationships. It's a stark reminder of how vital it is to protect bodily autonomy and champion a world where sexuality is a source of joy, not shame. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on all of this. What surprised you the most? Did anything resonate with you personally? Please leave a comment below, ask a question, or just join the discussion. It's so valuable to share our perspectives and learn from each other. And if you found this deep dive into history thought-provoking, please consider subscribing. That way you won't miss out on future explorations of history, culture, and the human condition. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you in the comments.